Thank you so much for being here this morning for this presentation in Adult Ed to hear the Reverend Dr. Tom Long. Today's topic is going to parallel very closely with what he said in this morning's sermon. Today we're talking about Christian funerals, what they mean, and how they got into trouble. So, Tom, why don't you go ahead and take off, and then we'll have Q&A toward the end.
Well, thanks for coming. A number of years ago, when I was teaching at Princeton Seminary, one semester I taught a course called Worship in the Reformed Tradition. Well, you could call it Presbyterian worship. And the goal of the course was to equip the students to lead every kind of service of worship that a Presbyterian pastor might have to lead, from Sunday morning to Lord's Supper to baptism to marriage to ordination, and of course funerals. I had good literature to put on the syllabus for all of those services except funerals. I couldn't find anything good on funerals. The last good book on funerals, in my view, had been published in 1954 and was out of date. A lot of stuff on grief, but not funerals. Well, I had to make do that semester, but I had a sabbatical coming up, and I said, I'm going to write the book I wish I had to put on my syllabus. Take the sabbatical and do it. 15 years later, I finished. It wasn't because I was procrastinating, it was rather that I so dramatically changed my mind. In fact, I got converted by my own research to the point that I ended up writing a book against the book that I started out to write. I'm going to talk about that experience a little this morning, and as I do, I'm going to be touching on some tender things: funerals, memorial services, death, and I'm going to call for some reforms and be critical of myself and others. But I want you to know that doing things 100% right is not the only criteria in worship. A heartfelt praise of God, whatever form it takes, is worthy. Many of the things that I'm going to raise questions about, my family has done over and over again. So I stand not simply as the critic outside, but as somebody inside who had his head turned by some of the research that I did, and I want to share it with you. The first insight that kind of knocked me over, and it shouldn't have, I'm embarrassed about it a little bit, but it was like riding through a barn on a horse and hitting a rafter. It so surprised me. And that was that funerals are based on a human necessity. Now, it seems obvious, but as a matter of fact, funeral directors today are often puzzled by the fact that in our society now, many people are saying, no service whatsoever. By which they mean, I want no ceremony, no religious ceremony, no funeral, no memorial service. We just want to take care of the necessities and be done. But what I realized is that funerals are not an option. Anthropologically, whenever someone dies among the living, the body must be moved, and fairly quickly. For reasons of sanitation and sanctity, no human society has ever allowed the dead to remain and decompose among the living. The bodies are moved. But no human society ever does that frivolously, as if they're taking out the trash. Every human society recognizes that in moving the bodies of the deceased, we are doing sacred work. And therefore, almost every society develops a ritual, words and prayers and songs that are sung as that movement is made. By the way, it was never intended that the funeral be inside the church, like most of us do them. As a matter of fact, you can find in some of the old Book of Common Prayer editions back in the 19th century and before, the rubric for the minister, the priest, is meet the family with the corpse at the gate of the graveyard and then walk with them to the grave. The funeral is a journey where we travel from here to there. And it raises inevitable questions. What is here? Where is there? Who are we to be carrying this person? And who is this person? In every major ritual of the church, there is what might be called a central sign act, a place where everything that's true about that ritual becomes visible and at the surface. For example, in baptism, it's the pouring of water or the immersion of water. Baptism is, among other things, a cleansing ritual, and the water itself is the central sign act. In the Lord's Supper we just experienced, it's the breaking of bread and the pouring of the cup, the giving of the risen Christ in the elements. In a wedding, it's the couple exchanging vows. That's what a wedding is. It's gathering around a couple as they exchange vows, surrounded by our promises and the promises of God. What I didn't realize was the central sign act of the funeral is not the eulogy where we remember the deceased. It's what we call in the order of the funeral the sending. It has two parts to it, a commendation and a committal. The commendation is where we raise our hands over the body of the deceased and say, "We commend to you, O God, our sister Elizabeth. She's yours, and we give her back to you." The committal is where the body of Elizabeth is burned or buried or however we take care of the disposition of Elizabeth, but we commit the body to the earth, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. This is the act of giving away our loved one back to God and back to the earth. That is the central sign act of the funeral. That was my first discovery, a revolutionary one for me. Now, how did we get to the Christian funeral? It took us 5 centuries, by the way, to get to a Christian funeral. Christianity was born as a Jewish sect in the Roman Empire. Funeral practices are pretty conservative. Until recently, in our capitalistic, commodified culture where they've begun to change more rapidly, funeral practices didn't change very fast. They were slow to evolve. It took us 5 centuries. We inherited Roman practices and Jewish practices. What were the Roman practices? Well, when a Roman lay dying, the family and friends, loved ones, would gather around the bed and they would chant and pray. And the closest relative would stand very close to the bed because that relative had a very important role to play. They would be listening for the death rattle. And when the last breath was being taken, the nearest relative's job was to lean over and kiss the dying person. The reason for that was Romans at the time of the formation of Christianity were Neoplatonists. And what that meant is that they had an anthropology that believed that human beings were kind of a piece of meat with an immortal soul in it. And when you died, the immortal soul escaped. And the kiss was an assistance to that escape of the soul. Where'd the soul go? Well, if the soul was purified, then it would go immediately to the source, back to God. But most souls aren't purified, and so they would go to another embodiment. They would be reincarnated on an ongoing process of purification. When the kiss had been given and the last breath had been drawn, the deceased would be lifted off of the bed and placed on the floor. They would be undressed. The eyes would be closed, the mouth would be closed, the features would be set. But before the mouth was closed, a coin would be placed in the mouth. It was called the viaticum. It was the toll across to the next incarnation or the next life. Then the body would be washed and wrapped in a shroud if it was an ordinary person, a toga if it was an important person, a toga and a laurel wreath if it was a really important person, and then placed back on the bed. And for 7 days, there would be mourning rituals. And during that time, somebody around the bed would constantly shout the name of the deceased. Junius, Junius, Junius. Reason for this is that premature burial was not uncommon in the ancient world, and you wanted to give Junius a chance. After 7 days, he'd had his chance. And at that point at night, people would gather with torches in red and black clothing, the clothing of death, and they would carry Junius to the place of burial. For reasons we don't quite understand, right at the first century, Romans were switching from cremation to earth burial. That goes back and forth in history. Right now in our culture, we're in a move toward cremation. But it had moved back to earth burial, and so they would get to the place of burial. They would sacrifice a pig and pour the blood on the ground. That made it sacred. Roast the pig and have a meal. Would put some of the meat and the wine beside the deceased, and then would bury him. Every year they'd gather back at the death site to have a memorial feast, and we have lots of Roman graves that have lead pipes that go from the burial chamber up to the surface. That's because it sometimes takes a long time for the soul to migrate, and so when those memorial feasts would gather, they would drop food and wine down into the burial chamber. That was what we inherited from the Romans. What did we do with it? No kiss. The reason is that Christians had a different anthropology. We don't think we're a piece of meat with an immortal soul. We think that God breathed into dust to create a human being. We're a unity of body and the spiritual life force. We also believe that when we're dead, and if we're going to live again, it's by resurrection, not by immortality of the soul. A lot of Christians, however, though, are more Platonist than they are New Testament Christians on this point, but there was no kiss. Although this is going to end at the graveyard with a Lord's Supper, and there at the Lord's Supper they greeted each other with a holy kiss, even the deceased. There was no coin placed in the mouth. Jesus had already paid the price. However, it got to be a desirable thing to die with the Lord's Supper in your mouth. And that last Lord's Supper was called the viaticum, same as the Roman word for the coin to take us over. The funeral was done not at night with red and black clothing, but during broad daylight in baptismal garments of white. So we modified the Roman process a bit. What about Jews? What did the Jews do? Well, if a Jewish person lay dying, those who loved this person would be gathering around, singing psalms, chanting psalms and prayers. And then when the person died, if it was a woman, the men would leave the room, and the women would take over the process of preparing the corpse. What they would do is they would wash the person, they would anoint them with fragrant oil, they would set the features, and then they would wrap the person in a shroud. And before sundown, if possible, if it wasn't the Sabbath, they would carry the person to the tomb, which was usually a cave in a hillside, and then they would put the person on a shelf in the cave and temporarily roll a stone in front of the cave, and then for 7 days they'd go back and engage in mourning rituals. They became eventually called sitting Shiva. 3 of those days, the first 3 days, somebody in the family had a big job. They had to go back to the tomb, find some help rolling away the stone. Sound familiar? And then they would go into the tomb to anoint the body with spices. 2 reasons for this. One, this was honoring the body, but it was also, you could see if it had moved in the night. Again, premature burial. After 3 days in the Palestinian heat, you knew, the stone was rolled and sealed. By the way, in the 11th chapter of John, Jesus' dear friend Lazarus has died, and Jesus is late to the funeral. He gets to the tomb of Lazarus, and he tells Lazarus' sisters, roll the stone away. And Martha says, no, we're not going to do that. He's been dead 4 days, and already there is an aroma. And Jesus said, roll it away anyway. Lazarus, come out. And out he came. After 1 year, Jews are an interesting culture. They experience double burial. They come back to the tomb, and at this point, roll the stone away again, and God has done a miracle. There are only bleached bones in there. And at that point, the deceased has become not ritually impure anymore. And at that point, they can freely gather the bones, put them in a bone box, put them in the corner of the cave, and the shelf is ready for the next member of the family who dies. What did we do with that? We pretty much followed it. Eventually, two differences. Jews wanted to be buried in Israel. In fact, we have in the Babylonian Talmud stories of people who were buried outside of Israel, and the corpse would burrow under the ground until it got back to Israel and could be buried in the land of the fathers and mothers. Christians were not interested in being buried in a particular country. They were interested in being buried next to the table at the feast. That's why in cathedrals you'll find clergy buried under the altar, and that's why in country churches the graves in the graveyard are close to the church. It's to be close to the table. The second thing we did different was to touch a corpse in Judaism was to become ritually impure, but Christians thought Jesus has changed the purity laws, and almost to a way that frightens us in modern medicine. They were eager to touch the dead body, to embrace the saint, to caress and to kiss the dead. They were holy saints to them. It took 5 centuries of modifying these practices, but then finally we got it. And here's what the earliest Christian practice looked like. Our sister Elizabeth is dying. We are gathered around her bed. Finally, she breathes her last. The men leave the room. The women prepare her body. They wash her. They anoint her. They wrap her in a shroud. And then we all come back in and we carry Elizabeth, chanting psalms and hymns and spiritual songs as we go to the place of burial. And there we have a Lord's Supper. It's a table that crosses timelines. It's Elizabeth's last Lord's Supper in this world and her first taste of the Messianic banquet. We greet each other with a kiss, including our sister Elizabeth. And then we bury Elizabeth, giving her back into the hands of the God who gave her to us. Now, do you see what has happened here? Baptism at the beginning of the Christian life has now been repeated at the end of the Christian life. When Elizabeth was baptized, we washed her in the river at the font. We anointed her with the oil of the Holy Spirit. And here at the end, we wash her again and anoint her. We gave her a baptismal garment of white. We wrap her in a baptismal garment of white. We ate with Elizabeth at the table of the Lord all through her Christian life, and now we eat with her once more at the table of the Lord. We bore one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, and now we bear the burden of our sister Elizabeth to the place of farewell. This is baptism reenacted. That endured as our basic metaphor. Elizabeth is a baptized saint traveling to be with God, and we are with her every step of the way until about 200 years ago. And things began to change in the 19th century for a variety of reasons. It's a long story. I'll give you a Reader's Digest version of it. We actually began to stop believing that Elizabeth was going anywhere. We never sat down and made that decision, but what happened to us in the 19th century, post-Enlightenment, Darwin, education, a number of things began to erode the fabric of the kind of default drive Christianity that was present in America. And it was no longer plausible for us much to imagine Elizabeth traveling to be in heaven or somewhere. Drew Gilpin Faust, who was president of Harvard, wrote a book called The Republic of Suffering, in which she said the Civil War had a lot to do with knocking the legs out from under our funeral theology. What we said to ourselves in the early 19th century When Elizabeth dies, what we imagined was she went to heaven, she was greeted by St. Peter, and then there was maybe her husband who had died before. They were reunited, and there were palaces and streets of gold, and Jesus welcoming her, and so on, in a very literalistic kind of way. But 500,000 dead men on the fields of Pennsylvania and Maryland, it's hard to make that literal theology work in mass death. And it got overwhelmed by mass death. So we never said it exactly, but we stopped believing that Elizabeth was traveling and we were accompanying her to give her to God. Elizabeth wasn't going anywhere. She was dead. Well, where she was going actually was into the ether. And so we would say things like, Elizabeth is smiling on us now, or we would say, we will always remember Elizabeth, which of course is a lie. Very few of us are remembered past a generation or two. Elizabeth is not traveling. I'm traveling. I, the mourner. Tom is the one who's traveling, and I'm traveling inside myself from grief and sorrow to restoration and stability. And so it's interesting. In the 19th century, Christian funerals were no longer about Elizabeth. They were about Tom. They were no longer about Elizabeth going somewhere. They were about Tom's psychic grief. And they became grief management. That's what we have been teaching for a long time to seminarians, that this is an act of pastoral care, and you're to take care of people's grief. It's important, of course. But 200 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that. We would have thought it's not an act of pastoral care, it's an act of proclamation. We are announcing by all the things that we do who Elizabeth is to Christ and what the promises of the gospel are. We're enacting in a public theater in a funeral the gospel of Christ. Now, how do we lose that? I mean, I've talked a little bit about it, but if you think about it, the old notion of Elizabeth traveling to be with God requires 4 things to be in place. First of all, we need a saint, Elizabeth. She has to be a sacred person. The second thing we need is a sacred story that we tell. We're traveling to be with God. The third thing is we need sacred land. I mean, this doesn't take place just inside in your quietness of your heart. This takes place across the landscape. And the third thing is we need people who are willing to do it. We need a sacred community. We need a church. And all of those things got in trouble. Take Elizabeth, the sacred person. 200 years ago, we would have thought this about Elizabeth. We value Elizabeth because of, well, she's Samuel's wife, and she's Benjamin and Mary's mother, and she teaches at the schoolhouse. She's a member of the Lutheran Church. She's a friend of mine. In other words, we valued a person by the ways they fit in. That's small-town America, small-town rural culture. Railroads come in, we got a lot of strangers, and all of a sudden, cultural anthropologists say we started valuing people in a different way. It wasn't how they fit in, it's how they stood out. Richest man in town, famous, standing, stature, celebrity. Well, not many of us are celebrities, right? But we can be one at our funeral. You know, Elizabeth, she was an Eagles fan. Look at that green casket she's got there. She loved Elvis. Let's pause for a minute while we play her favorite song, Hunka Hunka Burnin' Love. Would you play? In other words, we began to honor not the way Elizabeth fit into the fabric of the saints, but the eccentricities and whims and funny things about her. And so we had neighbors and nephews and former students tell jokes about her at the service and kind of magnify the eccentricities of her. We changed in our understanding what makes Elizabeth a saint. We also kind of lost nerve about the Christian gospel, and so we had to find another sacred story, and what better story than the biography of Elizabeth? Let's tell the story of Elizabeth's life, not in order that we might see the grace of God refracted in it, but we might replace the gospel with her biography. Sacred land, it's America. Nobody's from anywhere much anymore. I ran into my research ministers who were doing 1-minute funerals. What would happen is they would be in a retirement community, and Elizabeth would be in the pews, and then she'd get sick and she'd die at Mount Sinai Hospital, and they'd get the word, and the family back east would say, cremate her and send the ashes east, and suddenly somebody would have disappeared from a congregation, and so the pastor would say, I regret to tell you that Elizabeth Jansen died at Mount Sinai Hospital, and pray and have a 1-minute funeral. How about the sacred community? National Funeral Directors Association does statistics on this. Attendance at funerals and memorial services is way down. Attendance at visitation and wakes is up. Why is that? It's because if the druggist has died, I may be his customer, he may be a fellow church member, but I can't imagine what I would be doing going to his funeral. He wasn't a fishing buddy of mine. He wasn't a relative. What am I going to do, just sit back there and pray and sing? What use is that? But if I go to the visitation, I can maybe talk to his widow and I can be of some help to her. This is a psychological grief moment now. That's the purpose of all of this now. I would like to suggest some reforms. And you have to be like a good quarterback and audible on the field here. We can't do this in any pure way in our society. We wouldn't want to repristinate some 5th century practices. But if we have the vision of what we're trying to do at a funeral or a memorial service, we can do some things that bring that up more to the surface. And I'm going to be quick with this, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. First of all, I think we ought to watch maintaining a balance between Tom getting to plan his own funeral and the recognition that this is a service of worship that belongs to the whole community, including the family. The tendency is for me to make notes and say, I want these hymns and these scriptures, and my insurance policies are here, and so I want to be buried here, and I want this kind of casket, or I want to be cremated, or whatever, and have it all done. And we say, I don't want to be a burden on my family. Gilbert Mylander, a theologian, has written an article titled, I Want to Be a Burden on My Family. And he's frivolous about it at the beginning. I change your diapers, you can take care of me at the end. But his point is important and serious, and that is to take care of our loved ones at the point of death is holy work. And while we want to be reasonable about it, and you don't want to be a financial burden on anybody, to allow those who love us and those who have worshiped with us and those who have been our pastors to take care of us at the time of death deepens their Christian faith. It's a matter of a sacredness of work. Second thing I want to do in reform, this is the most controversial thing I'll say. I want to bring Elizabeth back to her service. We're the only people in the history of the world who have kicked the dead out of their own services, out of their own funerals. Now, there are all kinds of reasons why Elizabeth might not be here. We might have donated her body to medicine. We might have cremated her. None of these reasons is reason enough for us not to remember that this was a person, an embodied person, and carrying Elizabeth to the place of disposition is what we do as Christians. In the church where we worshiped in Atlanta, a woman died. She gave her body to Emory University Medical School. Good stewardship of the body, so she was not there at her funeral. But when it came time for the commendation, our minister came down from the pulpit and stood where the coffin would have been. And she raised her hands over that space and commended Margaret to the care of God. She made in our imagination the embodiment that her donation made impossible. in cremation, which is increasingly, I mean, we're moving toward, it's almost going to be universal for Americans to be cremated, and it's a beautiful and proper disposition of the body for Christians. But there's a distinction to be made. My funeral director friend Tom Lynch said, I can always tell the difference if the family says, we just want her cremated, meaning she's a hassle to us. Let's get the body out of here so we can do something cleaner. It's not just cremation. Cremation is a form of disposition of the body. It's the chosen one. And we can accompany Elizabeth not only to the cemetery, but to the place of cremation, if that's the choice. Not everybody's going to go, but some need to go and pray and sing at the place of disposition. Pay attention to the choreography of a funeral. The best Christian funeral is not sitting quiet in a room and saying nothing. Watch funerals on TV. They're the noisiest, most motion-filled of all human major rituals. Marching through the streets. And when I finished this book finally, the first funeral I went to, ironically, was my mother's. And having written the book, by golly, we were going to do it right. That immediately got me into two conflicts, one with my father, one with the funeral home. The one with my father was, I wanted it in their church. My father said, we live 20 miles from our church. We are old. We have outlasted all of our friends. We have only a few companions in the assisted living facility. The funeral home is a half a mile away. What do you want, a building or a congregation? We had it at the funeral home. But that conflict was, this funeral home was set up for a standard choreography. Everybody gathers. And then at the dramatic moment, a door opens over here. If there's a casket, it's rolled and set like a sofa in a furniture store window in front of the congregation. And then the signal is given to the minister who does the service. And then at the benediction, the casket is rolled out a double door there to a porte-cochere and a hearse and wherever it's going to go. What is that? A bird flying through a barn? I insisted we're not doing that. My mother came down the same aisle as everybody else. She was coming to worship. And in fact, the old rubric says if it's a priest, feet first, head first. If it's a layperson, feet first, because that's the posture you are in worship. And she was brought and turned not sideways, but this way. She worshiped with us. And then when the service was over, she was turned around, and we accompanied her out the same door everybody else went out. And we all went to the cemetery. Well, not all, but many went to the cemetery. It was a procession, a choreography. And the last thing I want to say is somebody has to go all the way with the dead. We often come to the little memorial service, but then that we walk away. And I was giving a talk like this at Valparaiso University one day, and it's hard to get to Valparaiso. You fly to Chicago, to O'Hare, you take a bus out to a station. Somebody from the university has to come out and get you to the station. And I was on the bus part. I was going over my notes. Across the aisle from me, there was a young father and his son, and they were in a good mood. They were wearing Walt Disney ears and Walt Disney World shirts. They'd just come back from Orlando. And the father was a gregarious guy, and he leaned over and he said, "Hi, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to Valparaiso University." "Oh, really? What are you going to do at Valparaiso?" I didn't want to tell a guy wearing Mickey Mouse ears that I'm going to talk about death and funerals, so I finessed it, but he pressed. Finally, I said, "I'm going to talk about the Christian funeral." He got real quiet. He said, "I am the one at my mosque in Wisconsin who washes the Muslim dead. I don't understand Christians. You leave before it's over. You leave before it's over." To go all the way with Elizabeth, our sister, and to give her to God with thanksgiving and tears. We give you back Elizabeth. You gave her to us. We now return her to you, the source of all life. It's a great privilege we have. There's so much more to say, you couldn't bear it all. So I'm going to stop. Rebuttals are welcome. Questions, rebuttals.
We do have a few moments for questions. Barbara?
Where does the ritual that some Christians consider about the rapture fit into what you're talking about?
You've asked a great question, and it deserves a longer and better answer than I'm going to give. But it seems to me that the interpretation of the New Testament, that there's going to come a time when the heavens open up and the righteous are going to be snatched up by Christ, leaving the rest of us here for a millennium or so, is a misunderstanding of the New Testament. If we understand the New Testament in terms of its rich promise, not holding it so tight literally to some of the verses and words, but to the whole theme that runs through there, what we are promised is that the whole of God's creation is being taken back into the life of God. And that those who are righteous and are saints and who live in the knowledge of this beforehand are the kind of first signs of what God is doing to renew and redeem the whole of creation. The promise is deeper than the rapture theology would have it, in my view.
Another question?
You discussed reforms. Have you actually seen those reforms taking place? And can you give us examples?
Yeah, I have. For example, by the way, the younger clergy, for some reason, get this. They have been schooled in the understanding of embodiment in a deeper and richer way than people of my generation. And they know that if you want to know who Tom Long is, watch what he does with his body. I was thinking about faxing this in. I would have been with you in spirit. No, I put my body here today. That counts. And you put your body here today. That counts. Younger clergy get that. And so, for example, one young pastor I know, he will say when there's a cremation, he will say to the family and all the friends, every setting he can do it, Elizabeth is going to be created at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the crematorium of the Jones Funeral Home, and I'm going to go, and I'm going to sing Onward Christian Soldiers, and I'm going to pray, and I'm going to read Psalm 23, and I would like for as many of you as will to go with me. And so he creates a congregation who goes, even when there's a cremation, It was a young pastor who did, I commend this. We have seen pastors begun to ask questions like, when we are in the hearse from the funeral to the crematorium or the funeral to the cemetery, what are some places in town that were important to John that we could go by? And the life story is told as you go through. Now, the nice thing about, or the bad thing about this, I guess, and the nice thing about other traditions is most of the mischief is done by educated white Protestant suburban people. We're the ones who've screwed the funeral up. The less white you are, the less suburban you are, the more landed you are, the more they understand what this practice is about. Some inroads have begun to come into the African American practice, but not nearly as many. There's a community of resistance there. And in the low country of South Carolina, as a way of indicating the power of life being given to us, life being given back to God, new life being given, when the body lies in the living room of the family, before they go to the church or the cemetery, they take the youngest baby and pass the child over the corpse of the deceased as a sign God takes away and gives. The life that we have been given, which we now must return to God, we are now given new life in this child. So all of these practices are trying to get at the essence of. Does that get at your question some? Okay. Maybe one more, I don't know.
I have one question.
Yeah.
In your research, did you find anything about the effect of COVID on funerals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're just kind of sifting that out. And one of the things that happened with COVID was we had thousands and thousands of delayed services. People would die, and even in some cases, the family would not feel comfortable gathering for the funeral. And so what they would say is, we'll do it when things get better. And things got better, but we didn't do it, and mostly. And so what we fear is that we've got a number of people who never got to go through the holy work of accompanying their deceased to the place of farewell. And we do know from earlier experience, when you don't do that, it remains unfinished work for you. And so we're trying to figure out, can we take All Saints services where the names are called and the bells are rung and make even more of them, especially for those that we lost during COVID and did not get to memorialize? That's one of the things that we found in the COVID research. Listen, there's so much more to talk about. You'll have to invite me back. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Tom's going to be preaching at the 11:15 service over in Rodney Chapel if you weren't here earlier.